Hello everybody, my name's Professor Rich and today I'm going to talk about what makes a star student versus what makes a terrible student. Which one are you? Let's give our students names. We're going to say that Galileo is our star student and Gary is our terrible student. These students bear no relation to any real existing people. Thank you. First, I'll talk about what really happens with Gary and Galileo, and then I'll talk about their attitude. And it's really their attitude that makes a difference. So if you're more like Gary than Galileo, then you should really think about some of the things I'm saying here. Most of the time, people won't be entirely Gary or entirely Galileo, but they'll have elements of either of these. So, what happens with poor old Gary? Gary probably has a level in English around about B1 or a good A2 normally. Gary often has been learning English for a long time. Gary complains that he takes English classes, but his English never gets better. Gary constantly forgets new vocabulary. Gary makes a massive effort to learn English, but normally for short periods of time, like maybe a month, and then he sees he's not making progress, stops, and then maybe takes up again next year. Galileo improves his English gradually. Galileo enjoys the process of learning. Galileo has many hobbies and interests which assist his English learning. Galileo students normally reach advanced level in about 5 years of study, sometimes quicker. So we can see there's a big difference here in Gary and Galileo. Do you relate to any of the things that I said? Let's talk about why this happens. And a lot of this comes down to attitude. So let's start with Gary's attitude. Gary wants to study fast. He wants to make a big effort, do lots of work in a short space of time, and he wants to improve quickly. Gary tries to work hard, but he finds it difficult. Studying English and the things he does to study English are not enjoyable for him. He has to force himself to do the homework. And he does force himself. And he does the homework for a while. But it gets more difficult because it gets more boring and more repetitive. And eventually, Gary doesn't want to do it anymore. Gary is learning only due to an obligation normally. So he needs to learn it for an interview, for his job, or because he wants to study abroad. Gary asks questions like, what's the difference between it and this? What does it mean? What does this mean? And often Gary is not very satisfied with the answer he gets to those questions. Gary wants to know, when do you use the present perfect? Gary learns words individually, often with translation, and he studies those words with repetition, like with flashcards or online repetition exercises like Anki. Now let's compare to Galileo. Galileo enjoys learning languages. Galileo enjoys many of the activities he does when learning a language. Galileo establishes fun habits which support his language learning. For example, watching anime to learn Japanese, or playing video games to learn English. Galileo is learning partly due to an obligation for his or her work or studies, but also Galileo just likes learning English. Galileo doesn't worry about the difference between words like it and this. Instead, Galileo wants to know what phrases contain those words. When normally do native speakers use them? In what situation? In what phrases? In what context? Galileo observes the use of real English and takes notes of anything he or she finds interesting. So if Galileo is watching a TV series and some character says something cool, he makes a note of that phrase. Galileo prefers to learn phrases, and Galileo uses techniques like personalization in order to help remember those phrases. So that's the difference between Gary and Galileo. Let's have a bit of discussion here. What's actually going on? Gary is approaching it much like learning maths or science at school. Gary is reading books and studying in that way. Gary is trying to acquire language like knowledge. Gary wants to know the rules of the language. So what's the problem with that? Well, language is partly about knowledge, but primarily it's a skill. It's something that you have to do. It's a very practical and applied skill. Learning a language is more like learning a musical instrument. You have to practice your scales. You have to get the muscle memory so you can play quickly and fluently. You have to sometimes improvise. Sometimes you'll do something that's not in the musical theory, but it still sounds good. You have to train your ear, so when you listen, you can hear the individual instruments, or in language terms, you can hear the different sounds of the new language. And with both language learning and playing an instrument, you have to perform. And it's true that speaking is a performance. When you are speaking to another person, there's always going to be an element of performance involved. And in more stressful situations, it might feel more like you're an actor. And that's kind of natural, really. The other thing that's important to consider is that languages aren't logical. You can pretend they're logical, and you can find explanations of grammar and things like that on the internet, and rules can sometimes be useful. They can be useful as generalizations or maps of the language. However, language is something that evolved naturally. It's much more like an art than a science. So if we keep asking questions in language like, what is the difference between this word and this word? Or, for example, why has someone used the present perfect there when that's not what the rule says? If we keep asking questions like that, then we're probably going to get very confused, because almost all of the supposed grammar rules have exceptions. In fact, I challenge you, post a grammar rule in the comments now which you think in English has no exception, and I will give you an example of real English which shows it does have an exception. So if we cling to these rules and think that language is individual words stuck together, then we're almost certainly going to get very confused, and it will hold back your language learning. So the point here is, to be more like Galileo, you need to let go a bit. Think of language as a musical instrument. You practice, you get better, you listen to songs which inspire you. The language version here is listening to people talk and going, oh, that's a useful phrase, I want to use that. The musical equivalent of that is, oh, that's a nice guitar riff, or that's a nice piano melody, I want to use that, right? The final conclusion that I want to make from this is about learning long-term. Learning languages is a long-term process. It is true that there are very exceptional individuals who can learn fluent language in like 3 or 4 months, but these people are 1 in a million. They are people who study so hard, and I mean like 9-10 hours a day of study. And they are people who tend to be very musically minded. They can hear the sounds and they're very good at imitation. And they use many of the techniques that I'm talking about naturally. The point I'm making is that's not you and it's not me either. We are not polyglots. We are average language learners. So that means we need to think long term. To learn a language to advanced level from basic, that's going to take you 5 years of consistent study and, more importantly, interest. You have to find hobbies which interest you, which support your language learning. You have to make it a regular part of your life. This is one of the reasons why people who go to English-speaking countries normally learn the language better. Notice I said normally learn the language better. They don't always learn the language better, actually, because sometimes people go to other countries, they spend all their time with people from their own country, and they still don't take an interest in the language, and they still don't develop interests which support their language learning. So doing that is critical. And there's so many things you could do to support an interest in language learning. Watching Netflix, joining an online reading group in English, joining online conversational classes. Check out the link in the description down below, profrichteaching.com. Joining a special interest Discord, which has regular meetings in English about things you want to talk about. Taking up an online course in something you'd like to learn more about, where the language of instruction is English. And so on, and so on, and so on. So thank you so much for watching, everybody. Make sure that you do hit that like button. It's really important. And do subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. More than anything, though, I would love to hear any comments or thoughts you have. It's great when people make a comment like, "Oh, fantastic video." But you know what? I really enjoy just hearing your thoughts. Which part of the video interested you the most? And how do you think I could improve these videos in the future? So my name has been Professor Rich. It's been my pleasure as always. And I will catch you later.